Okay. Hello, everybody. I think we're recording here live on Facebook. I see. Welcome, everybody, to the No Bonds podcast. Beck here, live from Medfield. No, that's not true. Live from Aruba, Orange, just out of Aruba. Matt, where are you? Oh, Matt, you're up in the Northeast. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Matt Maurizio's here.
Live from my barn in Acton.
How you doing, Matt?
This is my quarantine office, for the record, right here. What you're looking at, this is not some rustic scene that I have as a pinned backdrop. This is just my barn that I have. It's my office.
Great. Same. This is my quarantine office here.
Yeah.
But
it depends on what you're into. Beaches
or a few miles from
farm animals, whatever you're into.
Yeah, that's it. A few miles from the equator. Not a bad place to be in quarantine in this day and age. But welcome, everybody. It's great to be back on the No Bonds podcast here. I will say very excited with our guest today and some of the things that he is going to be talking about. Before we get into that, Matt, why don't you run through all the places that everybody can find us?
Sure. Well, if you're on Facebook, if you're on, besides the geographic locations, if you're on Facebook, you find us there. You can find us on all the social channels, at Beck Bode on Instagram. We're pretty active. LinkedIn, you can find each our individual handles on LinkedIn. Instagram at BenBeck3333 or at Matt Maurizio is me. We encourage engagement, so follow us, send us a DM. Love to chat. Or you can email us always, social@BeckBode, for any questions, concerns, comments, thoughts.
Awesome. Well, I'd like to say a few words about our guest today. Again, we're all here at Beck Bode really excited to bring on Joe Schipani. Joe is currently the VP of Sales Transformation at GE Digital. He focuses on client advocacy and education and sales, responsible for a portfolio of products from asset management to cutting edge analytics. Additionally, he's the principal at Schipani Companies, LLC, where he helps companies define their go-to-market and also their exit strategies. Their engagements have ranged from private equity advisory in the energy space, contract enterprise software, business exit advisory, early stage sales and analytics. He's worked with Shell, to name a few other really huge companies, GE, Nextera Energy, AES, Comcast, and Berkshire Hathaway Energy, just to name a few. A few other stats on him. He's got a Bachelor of Science, Chemical Engineering from Tufts University, Project Management Professional Certificate from BU, as well as a General Management Executive Education degree from there's a little school up in the Massachusetts area called Harvard.
Heard of it?
Industries, yeah, heard of it. I have heard of Harvard. It's no Northeastern, but
can all be.
Yeah, exactly. A few other skills and expertise: specialty in fine chemical, pharmaceutical, and biopharma industries, oil and gas upstream through petrochemicals, and most important to us, selfishly, power generation, transmission, and delivery expertise with respect to some of the major power plants and the electric grid, so to speak. So I guess my first question is, Joe, is there anything you don't do?
Yeah, it's good way started.
I keep busy. Trying to keep busy. Thank you. I'm glad to be here, by the way. Appreciate the extensive intro.
Well, this is what we do. No, I appreciate you being on. And why don't you give us just a quick introduction about what you're doing right now?
Yep, sure. So I work in a segment of GE Digital that focuses on power transfer. So everything from the electron leaving the generation facility to it being delivered to your door. There's a few kind of subcomponents of that business, the way that we break it down. We can talk about that, but I'm really looking at how are we bringing our products to market differently than we historically have. That's my job today. I still visit with lots of customers, running a strategic planning effort where we've got probably 20, 30 different customers we'll talk to, from independent system operators to independent power producers to the monopoly utilities that generally are targeted when people think utilities.
Gotcha. So you are in a space that is changing, and you're certainly helping companies take a look at that change and map paths forward.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a situation in this market where we'll see consolidation. It's harder and harder to operate the grid, and harder and harder to operate kind of legacy generation plants. Like coal plants have a ton of pressure on them today. So people are having to reinvent themselves, and I've been working with all sorts of different companies to that end.
Mm-hmm. Gotcha.
Can I hear how you got started in such a niche space with chemical engineering degree, project management professional? Why utilities? How did that start?
It's interesting. So like my luck has really just been being in the right industry at the right time early in my career. So I saw, I always aspired to be like a pharmaceutical biotech guy. In fact, I almost went to get a PhD in that space, but for family reasons, I needed to get out and into business and kind of started there. But quickly moved into this process control area, which is really what I do, right? It's kind of like keeping the lights on, keeping, valves opening and closing so things don't blow up. That's been my entire career. And I've just used that as a proxy, changing from one industry to another. And so, I've seen financial services and other spaces outside of the industrial space for about 5 of my 16, 17 years in career. But it turned out, like, I always thought the grass is greener somewhere outside the industrial space. But for me, being a chemical engineer, that's where I have a unique point of view. And that's been why I keep getting drawn back to it. Why am I in utilities today? Well, because, there's massive investment. The Rural Development Fund is just a huge sum of money in the US. There's still people that don't have power, right? I've been to the Philippines recently, before COVID. I was in Hong Kong in February, though, which was terrifying. But we're still touching people that have never had power, and being a GE is incredible with that, because we can put these really small generation facilities in rural towns in India and island nations and things like that. It's incredible. So yeah, I think that's wise. There's a huge impact, and there's still a lot of change happening.
That's cool. So I don't want to put words in your mouth, but it sounds like that niched area of focus that you've really carved a path in is consistent across multiple industries. You're in the utilities industry now, but is that what led you to starting your own LLC?
Sure. Yeah.
Early stage startups.
The irreverent answer is going through a pretty big exit, not getting a lot of money in it, and seeing the importance of ownership. But the real answer is, I built some muscle in kind of managing small companies between the kind of years of Cymation, which is one of the kind of mid companies that I was in, and in the next 5-10 years, just kind of seeing it over and over again. When you get reps, you get better at that. I think Ben knows a lot about reps and how you can get better at things like and such.
It's awesome. It's good.
Absolutely. No, it's obviously, as we said before, Joe, it's of particular interest to us and certainly our clients. Joe, as you know, we invest heavily in the utilities space, particularly electric utilities. And I find when I talk to a lot of folks that, they know utilities generally are pretty secure in terms, at least in relation to the overall stock market. They have a long history of being stable, paying out income in the form of dividends. And they're just set up very uniquely. But before, and we definitely want to hear some comments on your thoughts there. But one question I have for you, or one comment, is that, I look at what happened I get up out of bed this morning, for example, and I walk in, maybe the first thing I do is walk into the kitchen and flip the light on. The light goes on. I don't think a lot of folks really have an extensive understanding of how that all comes to be. I'm sure, like many folks, they understand, the where you live, it's hooked up to a power line, and that connects in some way, shape, or form back to a generation facility and infrastructure there. But can you give us the short version of what that path looks like, and what maybe some of the interesting parts of that might be, and how that applies to us?
Sure. I'll start with the raw material, right? So we all took like 8th grade science, potential energy, kinetic energy, and electricity. You can transform things, right? So you dig coal out of the ground, or you get natural gas, or you have the sun shining, and you can convert that into energy that usually is heating fluid, or is ultimately turning a turbine. And a turbine is the same thing that you see on the side of the plane that flew you down to Aruba, right? Very, very similar. And that's kinetic energy. That kinetic energy is moving a generator. It's converting that energy into electrons moving down a wire. Effectively, that's all that happens, right? As it moves across a wire. I think the things that are interesting to think about is when that energy gets produced, as soon as it hits the wire, it's moving. It's moving at the speed of light, and there's no stopping it. So there's not like in oil and gas, you just shut down a pipeline and it's shut down. It keeps going. And so there's a lot of complexity around managing transmission, which is like high voltage, and distribution, which is the thing that you see connected to your house. You would blow up your house if you kept the voltage in the high transmission lines touching your house. So they have to do a lot of complex things to step the power down and so forth. So I think that like what's interesting in the market today, what matters to utilities today is that customers like you and me, right? We just had a tropical storm up here. I have friends in Connecticut that still have no power. We care about the power being on. You want the switch to turn on. Right. And historically, utility companies had not even managed the distribution assets. So they just didn't know really what was happening out there. There's no SCADA system, which is a supervisory control and data acquisition system. Basically, the way it is, it's managing that high voltage line to make sure that you know what's happening everywhere all over the line, because it's really, really important infrastructure, right? If the transmission line goes down, hundreds of thousands of people may lose power. But the distribution lines, like 10 people might lose power. And so they would just react, right? Okay, I get an outage, I send some people. But people are demanding better than that. And with the change in like behind the meter stuff, like solar panels, what Tesla's doing, that's causing a lot of disruption to the business. And honestly, it's a shift of risk, right? Utility companies, legacy utility companies, have the entire infrastructure and the risk to their end customer. But Tesla's in there doing aggregation of a bunch of behind the meter solar and selling that back. That they're not taking any risk to the customer. Like the customer satisfaction isn't on them. And so you see California utilities really struggling with that. And I think the regulatory environment is complex. Big answer, try to squeeze it into a couple of minutes.
Yeah, right.
No kidding. So
absolutely.
Okay. I'm interested to hear how, from your perspective, where you kind of started to explain the evolution of the industry, where it's started with, I guess I may be incorrect, water, but you started with natural resources to generate power. And we're still there, but we're looking at more progressive renewable energy sources. What can you explain like that history and maybe where the future or the direction of where you see that the utilities industry going?
Sure. I mean, you look at countries and they're making commitments, right? By 2030, we're going to be off of dirty power. And there's massive variance between like the US and like Southeast Africa, where they're still putting up coal plants. But so the industry, like this is the most complex machine that the man has ever made. It's super, super intense to manage. It's all interconnected, right? Like just because I'm in Massachusetts doesn't mean that the power that's hitting me isn't the same thing that flows to California, right? It can move all across this stuff. It's super complicated. So we all used to do central generation. which means like we would take coal, oil, whatever, 1920s resource we could get and build something that would be considered critical to continue to run indefinitely. It would kind of just have to come up, stay up, and then it would never really shut off, except for very, very rarely. That's evolved slowly over the last 90 years or so, but not huge changes. And then really, starting maybe 20 years ago, but in the last 10 years, wild change in distributed energy resources. What does that mean? It means that people are putting solar panels on their own house. It means that there's intermittent generation, like wind, right? Wind doesn't just blow indefinitely, and you can't just put up turbines and say, I'm going to get 100 megawatts from this. It's going to turn on at 8 a.m. It's going to turn off at 5. I don't control it. Now, I can slow those turbines, unlike the flow of the electrons, but I basically am getting a certain amount of power from coal and the stuff that we know how to manage, but more and more of that power is coming from stuff that's vacillating. And so that's making it very hard to control the grid. I'll say one really technical thing, and it's the frequency response. So you have these wires with electrons flowing through them, and what's really complicated and dangerous and important to your power delivery is that the frequency with which those electrons are honestly like moving up and down. If you think of electrical wave, again, if you remember like maybe AP physics, it's a little spicy, but it's not college. So if you remember that, like managing the frequency on that line is hugely important because that'll take down the whole transmission grid if it goes too far out of phase. And so that's where the intermittent generation that happens from solar and wind is really messing with the utilities and how they're handling the grid. Did that answer your question, Matt?
Yeah,
your question.
We did, and then some, especially with AP physics talk. Yeah, no, I appreciate that. One of the companies that we have a particular interest in, and we talked about it before we started the recording, a company like Nextera Energy, which is, I think, focused a lot on some of that renewable energy and the direction of the future of the utilities industry. You've worked with them and others. Can you explain from your perspective what they're doing that might make them unique in that space?
Yeah, absolutely. So Nextera is an interesting one because you have Florida Power and Light, which is an actual balancing authority, meaning that they own the management of the grid as a public utility in Florida for most of Florida. You have TECO, Tampa Electric, for some sub-segments of Florida as well. They have a greater responsibility than some other utilities. But then they also have NEAR, the Nextera Energy Resources, which is an independent power producer, meaning they have power plants in California and New Mexico and all over the place. And then they also have oil and gas, which I think you know about. So Nextera is really interesting because they're, I would say, a more diversified utility than most. They're a company I've worked a lot with. I was talking to the CFO 2 days ago about some of their strategy and where they're going. Now, I'm not going to share that in detail, but I think that they view the market as very zero-sum, meaning they think there's going to be winners and losers, tremendous consolidation, and they need to be super aggressive in getting cost out of their operation. So I think that a lot of folks know, but if you don't, the way that utilities in the US work is they rate base capital expense, which means that you and I that consume power are directly paying for their capital investments. And there's huge sums of capital investments happening all over the place for the reasons that we described. They are extremely effective at that. And they're really, really good at getting cost out of their operations. I mean, the aspiration is to have half the people operating what most other companies are at by like 2022.
Wow.
If you think they have half the number of bodies in their plants managing stuff, and this is on the generation side, they're naturally going to be in a huge advantage.
Yep.
And in some of the other things that they're doing with like the space that I'm in specifically, I obviously bias towards software and optimization and analytics. The stuff that they're talking about doing there with managing a wind fleet. I mean, people talk about optimization of a wind turbine and they're like, okay, let me mess around with the pitch and yaw, which is kind of like the the big thing that's attached to.
Yep.
How does it go this way, and then how does this top piece go?
Cool.
A lot of people talk about that, but they're talking about how do my hundreds of them interact with one another. They're doing crazy stuff. It's insane. And it's not just them, of course, but they're really looking at, like, we're going to dominate the independent power wind production space. I love them as a company. I love them as a customer too. But they're just a really progressive firm.
Cool.
Quick, thank you for that. And quick note for all of our listeners and Matt, pitch and yaw are two vocabulary terms that will be on the test next week.
Exactly.
So make sure that you watch the replay and take copious notes on pitch and yaw in particular. I'm going to give you that insight into the test next week.
No doubt.
I know we're pushing up against time here, Joe, but a couple things that you touched on a minute ago in terms of Florida Power and Light owning the management grid for a good part of Florida. And also what you said about the ability for companies to pass on the cost of capital expenditures directly to consumers. You know, utilities, investing in utilities, a reason for doing so. It's been said that, some utilities are in a way from not necessarily so much a generation side, but certainly an infrastructure and transmission side can be viewed in some way, shape or form of a government-sponsored monopoly in a way, given that they are in a particular geographic area. What can you tell us about your thoughts on that today versus maybe even 5 or 10 years ago? And you mentioned some things about consolidation in the industry. Yeah. Again, I know we're pushing up against time, and I asked you about 13 questions in the form of one, but I just wonder if you had any thoughts there.
All good. Yeah, I think that we are seeing, so first of all, regional transmission operators or independent system operators, there's kind of two flavors. Florida has FPL do it, and they're also a utility. In New England, we have New England Independent System Operator, or New England ISO. They're in Holyoke or Haverhill. They have all of New Hampshire and Maine and Vermont and Massachusetts. They're an independent, non-government organization, not for profit, but they independently operate all the power up here. So it's worth noting that there's different spaces, and it may be pertinent when you're thinking about buying a stock to understand that. I think that the kind of net question to me there was, how are these companies managing all this and the monopolies? How does that manifest to investors? And I think that the answer is, because there's pressure and change because of the distributed energy resources we talked about earlier, there's going to be people that were kind of legacy focused. And I could point to companies, I'm not going to point them out directly, but there are companies with like huge coal fleets still that are focused on optimization of those. And that scares me for those firms. I think that you're going to see a move of divestiture and move that into, like, a Starwood is a perfect example of a company that's buying stuff like that because they're operating it like, I have a 3-year amortization of that asset and I'm depreciating it out, and that's actually good for me. I'm fine with that. I'm going to shut it down, and I know I'm going to shut it down. Whereas companies that are thinking, I'm going to hold on to this, pretty dangerous. I think the future state, like 10, 20 years, our kids, it's going to be small gas plants, lots of intermittent stuff, and you're going to see the grid really turn over. So massive capital expense opportunity for the companies that make money through that, because the grid investments are going to be huge. And a big risk to the firms that choose poorly. And I could get into, like, the digital side is so important. Like, I see it, and I see companies that are going aggressive on digital are companies I would invest in.
Yeah, and interesting perspective too, because I mean, obviously we've got a number of clients that are either watching this live right now or going to be watching the replay. And certainly a big part of both of the strategies that we run is that we don't own an index of all utilities, or an index of all, if we're not even talking about our utility strategy, but our growth. We are very, very specific in terms of companies, for example, on the growth side, that are very, very well positioned fundamentally to be able to grow their earnings, as evidenced by analysts revising upward the earnings estimates, future earnings estimates of the company. And likewise, on the utilities end, certainly there's still a rather large utilities universe. We own 10 individual utilities companies out of the entire universe out there, and in large part primarily dictated by that utility's ability to raise its dividend payment over the next 12 months, obviously manifesting into higher income for our clients next year versus today. And I think you hit it right in the head there, whether you're talking about a utility or whether you're talking about a growth company that's not even connected to utilities. It's important for us to be very concentrated and focused on a small group of companies that really, for example, Nextera, as we mentioned, is one of our top holdings firm-wide. Companies that are really doing some great things that fundamentally have very, very bright futures. And I think that's important in anything, but particularly investing. We see a lot of investing out there today where it's more so blanketing the universe in terms of putting money into everything out there versus being really specific and focused on a handful of companies that are really, really well positioned. So I appreciate that explanation. And we're already pushing 4 o'clock here. And admittedly, I could talk to you about this for the next 13 hours if I had my choice. But Joe, really, really appreciate you coming on to the No Bondcast here with Matt and the rest of the firm. Thank you for the time today, and perhaps sometime down in the future we can have you back on again. But I really appreciate the time and the insight.
Thanks. It was great to be here. Appreciate you.
Yeah, thank you, Joe. I feel like we hardly even scratched the surface of your expertise, what you do on a daily basis.
They can DM you. We can certainly chat here if someone wants to have a specific conversation. I'm happy to do it.
That's awesome. Thank you for offering that. That was good.
Thank you. Matt,
Cool.
You want to close us out?
Yeah, look, thanks for, whoever stayed to the end, appreciate you listening. If you have questions, insights, send us an email, social@Beck Bode, or you can follow us on Instagram @Beck Bode. You can send us a DM there. You can send Ben, myself, a DM about questions for future
or an email
podcasts or anything you want, really. Topless workout pics from Ben, that happens too. You can ask about those. Joe loves it. Oh, man. Joe, one other thing we didn't mention, if people want to follow you or learn more about you, is there a spot where they should find you and look for you before we close this out?
I'm most active on LinkedIn, and so you'll see me on LinkedIn / I think it's Joe Schipani. LinkedIn / Joe Schipani is the best spot to find me. I'm at Joe's Notes for Instagram, which is not particularly interesting.
Joe's News for?
Joe's Notes, NOTES.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool.
And Twitter, but I'm not active on those.
All right. LinkedIn is the spot for Joe. No, we appreciate you, Joe. Thank you for coming on. Ben, good luck at the equator. Don't burn yourself.
Thanks, guys.
All right.
Thanks, guys. Thanks,
See you guys.
Joe. See ya.